Because we can't go to the theatre, we're deprived of theatrical dialogue in all of its senses. So I thought I would do a series of interviews with contemporary British playwrights, talking about their work as a way to keep thinking about theatre, writing, and the world. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce to you David Greig. How to introduce his work. It's really hard to do this. He's been writing for 30 years. He is, in addition, extraordinarily prolific. I used to try and keep a chronology. I had a file on my computer that I tried to maintain a chronology of his work, but I had to kind of give it up. In the first, I think it was the first 10 or 11 years of his writing life, there were 28 separate pieces that had all been performed. By now, he's probably written, I really don't know, 70, 80 plays, something like that. By the time I finished this introduction, he's probably finished another one. The other reason it's really hard to describe his work is that it's extraordinarily varied. You know, he's written dramas, he's written texts for live art, he's written texts for devising companies, he's written adaptations, puppet plays, plays for children, translation, plays in verse, radio plays, and the book for an enormous West End musical. Of this vast array of work, some of my favorites include 1999's play with the wonderful title, The Cosmonaut's Last Message to the Woman He Once Loved in the Former Soviet Union. It's a play that bounces between locations, between countries, and into outer space. It tells a beautiful story about love, longing, and loss. San Diego from 2003 is an endlessly playful play about community, parenthood, love, flight, the local and the global. It's a play in which David Greig is actually a character, but fascinatingly, not very long into the play, is murdered. And the kind of riot of dramaturgical freedom that's unleashed by that play starts to say something really fascinating about the possible connections between the conventional systems of theatrical relations and the conventional systems of global relations in the world that have echoes of Frantz Fanon and people like that in the characters rising up against the dramaturgical master. In 2005, the American pilot, which he wrote for the RSC, imagines an American airman who's shot down in an unspecified tribal landscape, and it plays with the culture clash, with issues of translation and the place of America in the imagination of the world. And it's also, in its original production by Ramin Gray, one of the most convincing examples I've seen of a Brechtian theatre production made completely compelling in the 21st century. And Brecht is one of the most important influences, I think, on David's work. The Strange Undoing of Prudencia Hart is a jagged, jangling play in verse, which toured pubs to tell its kind of Faustian story of a search for authenticity. Both the events and his adaptation, David's adaptation of The Suppliant Women, again in breathtakingly good productions by Ramin Gray, made brilliant use of local amateur choruses to devastating and rousing effect. 4 years ago, in 2016, he became the artistic director of Edinburgh's Royal Lyceum Theatre, and I think by pretty common agreement, has turned that theatre into one of the most exciting venues, not just in Scotland, but in Europe, really. It's a delight to speak to David Greig. David, hello.
Hello. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing? How are you finding lockdown?
It's a very bracketed response. I mean, basically, you know, very well, very healthy. Feel very privileged and lucky because I have a garden, and my kids are grown up, so I don't have any of the things that would be very challenging for other people. But the so the actual that is fine. I think the two things I'm observing, there is oddly an excess of communication. So you would think that this would be a time of isolation, but actually I'm finding there's an awful lot of Zoom, obviously, like this, an awful lot of phone, and weirdly I'm finding it's very tiring, oddly. It's like it's really strange. I'm not doing nearly as much walking around or anything as I would do on an ordinary day, but I suppose I was thinking, ordinarily you meet somebody and then in a coffee shop, and then you go for a walk to the next place, and then you're on a bus for a little while, or a train, and all those little natural breaks are sort of gone. Everything is compressed.
Yes.
So I'm finding that a bit strange. And work-wise, not so much writing, but obviously for the theatre is it's very concerning.
Yeah.
Because albeit we're all on furlough and in hibernation just now, there is a real worry about what the next year or so might be like for theatre. And I don't know if we'll get into talking about that, but obviously in the background, running the Lyceum with my gang, that's very much on my mind. So like the actual lockdown bit is quite fun, but but some of the work stuff, it's just odd, I think. I had an interesting discussion. Zinni Harris and Wills Wilson are associates for the Lyceum, and we had a Zoom last night. And we were agreeing that there was very much during this period days, like you can have just bad days. And it's not really clear what's caused it. It just sort of, it's an emotional reaction to all of this strangeness. And some days you're fine, and then other days you get this, and it's difficult. You can't even really pin down what might cause it, but it's probably just, this is really strange, and there are days where you really feel it getting to you, and then other days where it's fine, and other days where it's even interesting and good. But
yeah. I mean, I suppose I don't know how much you can really talk about this, but do you have? I love your coffee cup, by the way.
Oh, is it? I am a twat. My son, that was his gag, and I forgot. Sorry.
That's very good.
Very
yeah, I mean, I don't know how far when and how you're going to reopen.
Yeah. No, it's not a secret. I mean, we're working to a plan which, roughly speaking, goes. We expect we'll be able to open in some way, shape, or form, probably around about August, September. But we don't know when we'll know that, and we also think it's possible that it might be an opening which, for example, could be limited to 250 people, and our theatre is 600, so it could have caveats.
Yeah.
We're also then looking at Christmas, which is for us, obviously, I mean, it's really, I can't emphasize how important it is for our finances. It's the biggest show every year that we do, and it has the biggest revenue. Now we don't know if Christmas will happen, because we think that the spike pattern that we have been told happens is that the disease can come back. And that winter is the spike time. So we're feeling very anxious about Christmas. So where we're planning at the moment is we're looking at trying to put a program together for the year 2021, possibly starting in late January, because we think that's plannable for. We sort of think it's not unreasonable for us to make some assumptions that we could potentially sell tickets for those dates. And then what we're doing with the autumn possibilities is we're putting together a kind of opportunistic program, which if if we are allowed to open, we can sort of suddenly throw in these probably like bare stage, three-hander, maybe even work with a little ensemble or something, shows. And one of the things that's interesting about that is the nature of our audience is that their subscribers, they're over 60 by and large, just because that's the way theatre, I mean, theatre audiences skews older, but the subscribing regional theatre audience is even older. So, and they like planning and they like to see the brochure and all of that stuff. So we're in quite an interesting position where if we do open in the autumn, we will possibly not have access to that older audience, because it's conceivable that either they literally won't be allowed out or they won't want to come out.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to do is look at it as a kind of three-phased thing, where autumn might be an opportunity for us to put on work that is very fast and dirty and designed to appeal to quite hardcore culture fans, and possibly take a few risks, really, in a way. And then Christmas, I'm hoping, if we can do Christmas, that we can attract a family audience back. But then I'm looking to try in the new year, I'm going to really rely on the subscribers, because what I'm very worried about is that theatre audiences generally, any theatre that's been through a capital project will tell you that it's very hard to get the audience back, and that even though you think, oh, of course they'll come back, it's only 2 years, actually they've got out of the habit.
Yeah, right.
So I think we're going to really rely on the subscribers and the hard. I think there's a really interesting thing where we've moved from being a theatre that could almost take our subscribers for granted. They would come to the theatre anyway, and then we would just try and attract a wider audience as well. I now feel that as we move into 2021, we need to kind of almost go the other way and say, we've got to start by making sure that our subscribers want to come.
Yeah, right.
And then building outwards from there. So it's quite, each task is slightly different and quite interesting.
Right.
I don't know if that's of any interest, but basically, yeah, we're kind of thinking 2021. I suppose the way I've said it, that it sounds dispiriting, but I mean it positively, is the day we open the 2021 Christmas show is the day that I will 100% believe that this is behind us as a phase.
And not wanting to get even grimmer, but of course, in terms of your own writing, I mean, there are 2 shows. Local Hero, that's been postponed. It was about to open at the Old Vic, and Adventures with the Painted People. Is that right?
Yes, those are less dispiriting. I mean, Local Hero probably will survive in some way, shape, or form. We'll get it on in the end, so I'm not too worried about that. I mean, I'm sad. Obviously, I was excited for it opening, but I'd rather it opened when it has a chance to have an audience than at this time. Adventures with the Painted People was going to be a 2-hander for Pitlochry Theatre this year. What's happened with that is we're going to do it as Culture in Quarantine. The radio. So basically, we're going to make it a radio play, but done from. We'll record it in quarantine, and then it will go on at Pitlochry the year after.
Right.
And possibly at the Lyceum as well, because 2-handers for which the theatre does not have to pay a royalty will be in very high demand. So unless the play is really shit, which is also possible, but assuming it's not really shit, I think it will find its way to both theatres.
I was really interested, of course, though, and very much looking forward to Adventures with the Painted People, in part because, am I right in thinking this is your first original full-length play for about 7 years?
Yes,
it is, because I'm thinking the big shows:
Lanark,
Charlie, The Lorax, Suppliant Women, Touching the Void, Solaris, Local Hero.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Of course, I would, in brackets to all of those, say
of course,
that the adaptations in some instances were so wildly themselves that but yes, I mean, absolutely, it is the first play that is not an adaptation for 7 years since the event.
Why is that?
Um, I'm not sure I rightly know, except because actually there is well, there is a strange thing, which is that there is a kind of bus queue of plays that I've carried around for, in some instances, up to over 10 years, which are quite ready to be written. I mean, they really have had quite a bit going for them. They even have directors attached and all sorts of stuff. But I think that particularly when I got the job at the Lyceum, there was a way in which an adaptation was easier to it felt somehow less vain to put on an adaptation in my theatre.
Right.
So if I put so someone said, would you like to adapt Touching the Void? And I'd go, yes, if I can put it on in my theatre. And then we go, okay. And then suddenly you've got a project and it's all happening and you can sell it and it makes sense and everything. Whereas a little bit, I had the feeling, particularly in the first few years, that if I put on a play that was just a play by me, it was a bit like vanity publishing or something. So I think I sort of parked some of that other stuff.
Right.
But what happened about a year ago was I was in Australia, and a director who I've worked with a lot there, she's done a lot of my plays in second productions, called Ella Caldwell. She said, why haven't you done any new plays? Her company does second productions of new plays. She said, I want to do a play. Why haven't you done one for ages? And I sort of said this, and she said, well, what are these plays you have half written and all of that? And so I showed her some, and she said, well, I want to do these plays. Why aren't you doing it? And she basically said, you're being an idiot. Part of your job, in the same way that if you're a director, your job is to direct work for your theatre. Part of your job is to write work for your theatre. So she sort of gave me a scolding from a distance and actually did prompt me to reconnect to the thought of doing new plays. And so that led to a play called Summer Special, which is going to happen. Well, if we had announced our season, which we would have been doing now, it would have been a part of that. I think it'll still be part of what we do in the future, which is now ending up being an Australian, we would have Australian involvement because of Ella, and also Swedish involvement. The Malmö State Theatre, we were going to collaborate on this play called Summer Special. And that would have been, that theoretically was going to be my first original new play.
Oh, right.
And it really was prompted by Ella's scolding. But then Elizabeth, who is quite a force at Pitlochry, she's really new, extraordinary woman, has sort of changed Pitlochry from being rather a staid sort of, almost very old-fashioned repertory, to really a sort of theatre of social change and place and dynamism. And she wanted to do a project called about the Tay River. And I was, as you may know if you follow me on Twitter, I'm very obsessed with sort of Pictish hill forts and various things like this. So I was sort of boring her about the fact that the Tay River has these various Pictish and Roman sites along the edge of it, and it's really the Tay River is the furthest reach of the Roman encounter with Caledonian Scotland. And she said, would you like to write a play about this? And I genuinely sort of thought she meant like a sort of 5-minute thing that you would sort of pop on the website or something like that, or I sort of was imagining she was talking about, that sort of thing that one sometimes gets asked, would you contribute a 10-minute play to our festival of, cheese making or something, and you think, oh yeah, that might be fun, and you sort of do it, and you don't think of it as proper thing. But then I got this terrible shock because she sent me through the brochure, and it was clear that what she was she was meaning a full-length play, So I found that I had committed to write a play, for, but by that point I was actually quite excited by the idea. So it's nearly done. I mean, to be honest, I'm really liking writing both of them. Both plays I've really loved.
I want to talk about obviously about your original plays in a
I'm sorry, I'm going to do this. I can't believe you did that.
I mean, exactly what Rory intended. Is exactly what's happening. Which is great.
Well.
But I want to stick on adaptation actually for a moment, just because I think adaptation is actually a really interesting process. I often, as you know, I've done quite a lot for radio, lots of adaptations of novels, and I often think sometimes it's the point where I'm most conscious of what I know as a playwright in terms of craft. And I wonder how you approach adaptations.
Yeah, I do love it. I mean, and partly I think I would say this, but I seek out, my favorite thing is to be offered an adaptation, which I know that when I say to people, I'm adapting this X, they will go, oh my goodness, how could you, how is that going to be possible? I mean, I don't understand, and I think that is, so put it this way, if I thought I knew how to adapt it, I wouldn't really know how to do it. Whereas there's something about touching the void where you think, well, I mean, that's just, how are you going to do that? It's just, I just don't get, when Lanark was so enormous, and Solaris and everything with the sort of space stuff. So I love that bit of it. But yes, I think it, how do I approach it? I suppose I start, there's always a moment where I think, what would W.S. Graham do? And so W.S. Graham wrote, his poems often know that they're poems. So he sort of, it's like he turns everything inside out. So he takes an idea that another poet might do in a particular way, and he somehow, I can only describe it as turning it inside out somehow. And so I find that quite helpful. So when I think about Touching the Void, for example, I start by thinking, well, it's like, there's an obvious way to do Touching the Void, I think, and maybe even a sensible way, which would be to sort of repeat the film and have three actors sitting on a chair and they just tell you the story in a really gripping and interesting and dramatic way. But I thought, well, people won't expect to come to the theatre and, like I said to Tom Morris, I want people to sort of have their hands sweating in fear, and to feel thing. So that was one. So in a weird way, the thing of saying, we're going to do it, sort of that was thing. And with that one, I think the other thing about it was, the W.S. Graham thing was, I was thinking that if it began, right, the whole thing about this is, how do you tell a story where we know that the author survives? So so I thought, well, if it begins with the author's funeral, then you're going to think, oh, hang on, what's going on here? I don't understand, and that led quite quickly to the idea of a fantasia and an in the mind. And then I in the book, there's quite a bit where he talks about crawling in this along the glacier, and he talks about hearing Boney M and singing Brown Girl in the Ring, and he talks about a voice in his head that sort of berated him. So that then started to create a possibility where you could see a kind of inside out telling of the story. So that would be an example, I suppose.
Do you think, I mean, I'm going to talk later, I've got lots of questions about Solaris actually, but so I'll hold off on that for a second. But do you find, when you're adapting, that when people talk about adaptation, the sort of the bugbear, the difficult concept is always kind of fidelity and faithfulness,
Yes, yes.
because it's a sort of fruitless conversation, but it nonetheless seems to always come up in it. How does that figure for you? Are there points where you go, I know I can do this because that feels okay to do that with this book, but if I did that, that would be unfaithful to it? Or what is the nature of responsibility you feel towards the book?
Well, I would say that it's an ongoing process. It's not like I sort of worked out a system and then apply it every time. But
Sure.
In general, I would say I'm not very interested in fidelity. I think there's a few things about it. I suppose brutal experience has taught me that you can get very caught up in ideas of fidelity to books and things.
Yeah.
But when an audience is sitting in a theatre, even the ones who care don't care. It's like actually all they care about is what is in front of me entertaining me sufficiently? Right. Is it not just entertaining? Is it gripping me? Is the story being told? So when you've had that thing of, oh, but we must have the cheese scene. The cheese scene is iconic. Well, if you haven't got it in such a way that scene is truly getting the audience in, then it's awful and you can feel it. So I suppose the first thing is the understanding that also you'd be really amazed how many people don't know things. So you might think that Lanark is an enormously famous Scottish novel, but really 95% of the audience haven't read it. And even the ones who have, it was years ago and they only half did and they don't really remember it. So there's, Touching the Void. I mean, when it opened in Bristol, I remember one person in the bar on the way in saying, is this the one where the man chews his own arm off? So they had a vague idea. They'd mashed together 28 hours or whatever it was. And so even a thing like Touching the Void, where you would think people know this completely, actually still a big chunk of the audience won't know it at all, and they'll just care about what you've put in front of them. So one thing is that. I think the other thing is I really believe that you have to find a way where you think that this is going to be better than whatever the original material you're working from is. So what I mean by that is it has to be a kind of arrogance, but you have to sort of say to yourself, well, Joe Simpson's book and this movie were all very well, but really this won't fully realize its potential until it's a play. And and because if you don't think that, then really it is a bit pointless to do it. So again, that sort of pushes you against fidelity. But I think there is another thing that's important, which is I do like to begin with finding what I believe to be the gesture of the original material. And so the question I ask myself is, what would a person coming to see this play reasonably expect to find? What would annoy them if it wasn't there? And what would surprise them? And I think that, so there is, so Solaris, if you come to see Solaris, I think you can reasonably expect that it is a science fiction story and that it does take place in space and that there is a planet. And I think you can reasonably expect it to have elements of dread and so on, and fear, genre feelings. But I think you can change the lead character from a man to a woman. I think that's totally fine. And I don't, and I think anybody that annoys, I don't mind, but that's not to be frivolous. It's like, I think I'm not really going against the gesture of the piece of work. I'm sort of uncovering some other things. does that make sense? But also the question, what would annoy them if it wasn't there? That is to an extent reasonable. I mean, I think if I'm going to adapt Touching the Void and I didn't have somebody cutting a rope, well, I'm just being a dick, you know. So it's not. So the fidelity isn't. I don't think you need to be faithful, but I do think you need to ask yourself the question: why are you doing this, and what would an audience reasonably expect to see, given that you are doing this? Also, sorry, I should say one other thing is, which in many cases you're dealing with living authors, so you also have to negotiate the estate and all of that stuff as well, which can make a difference.
So as I say, I'm going to come back to talk about Solaris in particular, but thinking, I suppose, more about your original plays. Is there a typical way that your plays start? Do your plays tend to start with an image that occurred to you, or something you read in the paper, or a line of dialogue, or a character, or something, or are they always different places?
No, there is a sort of, there isn't a typical way. They are different, but there is a thing, like I said before, that I carry them around for a really long time, which is, so there is a thing that when a play emerges, it is actually sometimes quite annoying, because I'm sort of thinking, oh shit, you know, I've got 6 of these bastards to write, and as I say, some of them have been hanging around for quite a long time.
Right.
What I have recently found is that I really need a partner to make a play happen. So there's really 2 things. The play's birth is usually an idea or an image, it's more often a kind of area of thought that then crystallizes in a moment. So I was interested, for example, I had a long area of thought around the Middle East. I was just interested in it, and I was reading all kinds of things. I was going to the Middle East, and I was involved in the Middle East, and I kind of knew that there should be a play there somewhere. But then I'll sort of do a short version of this story, but basically I discovered, doing a bit of research, that the idea of love, romantic love, was imported to Europe via Persian, from Persian poets, with the Muslim expansion across North Africa into Spain. And from Spain, it was, so in Spain, the Arab word tarab, T-A-R-A-B, which means to sort of be very stirred up, to have your emotions stirred up, particularly by music or by dance, and is associated with this particular type of poetry. In Spain, the musicians who were the purveyors of tarab, i.e. they went around playing music that got people all stirred up and telling stories and poems that got people all stirred up, they were called tarabadors, and that became quite quickly the troubadours of southern Europe, who then were associated with the chivalric knights and everything. And in my version of this, quite quickly, this new idea, this newfangled notion, romantic love, arrives in Europe. And so when I was thinking about that, and then I thought, well, that's funny as well, because the knights, really quickly, the Pope wanted to get rid of because the older knights could inherit, but the younger sort of aristocrats had nothing to do. They were just wandering across Europe, fighting each other, and causing mayhem. So the Pope basically sort of said, right, you need to all go on a crusade, sort of get them out of Britain. So the knights and all of their entourages went off back to the Middle East, carrying with them their troubadours and their chivalric love. And I thought that was sort of funny. I just thought this idea of this love being taken around as an idea. And I had this image. But all of that, so I had read all of that, but then I did have this image of a Scottish knight, who's sort of late to the party and is trying to catch up with the rest of the Crusaders. and he's like the second son of somebody from, a fairly poor estate in Fife, and I thought he would have with him a bard who he wants to be a troubadour, but the bard doesn't really. It's quite Howard Barkery, isn't it? But he doesn't like. Doesn't buy this whole thing, this whole love thing that he's supposed to make up songs about. So that was funny. And once I had that thought, then there was a lot of delight in sort of starting to sketch the play that might emerge from that. Now, the reason I say this is that play hovered for quite a long time, but then I met Tom Morris doing Touch the Void, and Tom really liked the idea. And now it's like I'm the mummy, and now it's got a daddy sort of thing, or whichever way around you want to put it. And so now it can exist. So because now it's shared between me and somebody else, and so the next thing that will make it exist is when Tom puts tickets on sale, because that will force it into existence. But basically, what I have found is I can't make a play come into existence on my own. It has to have somebody else who is equally invested and is sitting, sort of, drawing it from me. Right. So Elizabeth, for example, so with Painted People, that was just a silly idea, but it's Elizabeth who goes, no, that's the play I want. You've got to give me that play. What's happening with that play? And she starts to pull it forward, and then, but also would have reactions to things. So if, as you talk about it, you sense, oh no, that's the interesting bit of this idea. But I'm thinking that because I'm seeing how it's reacting to the director. I mean, that person is always the director, I would say.
Right.
And so these plays that are queuing up, the thing that makes them begin is partly an idea, but I don't think they really begin until they're attached to a director in some way, and then they're birthed from there.
Because that's, Akeborn famously used to do that, didn't he? He used to announce the new play in the season brochure, and at that point, all he had was a title, and he'd go, this is a great title. And he would go, well, it's going to open on the 1st of October. So in August, I really have to write this.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, there is a thing, I've said it as a joke, but it's not a joke, that I have found that I can't write until the consequences of writing something terrible are better than the consequences of writing nothing at all.
Right.
And the trouble with that is that the more established one becomes as a playwright, the closer that moment comes to opening night. Because obviously, if you're a baby playwright, then if you write something terrible and show it to a director, the consequences are sort of fine. And if you write something good, that's great. So it's sort of doesn't really matter. You could write it on your own and show it to people. But for me, if I say, let's do this play, and then I show people something that's shit, that they will go, oh, what? Oh dear, David, I don't know what you're doing here. Whereas if I don't show them anything, they'll imagine a good play, because they think, well, David, he writes good plays, so if he's imagined it, it's probably good. So let's all imagine this good play. So that can sustain you for a really long period of time.
Right.
Until there comes a point where obviously rehearsal is going to begin, or a workshop or some sort of event is going to begin. And at that point, it becomes, the consequence of not writing any words down becomes so humiliating and embarrassing that even shit writing is better than no writing at all. Right. And so that then becomes at the writing moment, and which is unfortunately quite an unpleasant process in some ways. But not to be frivolous, I think what it's to do with really is anything that's written before that moment. It's not just that I'm worried it'll be shit, it's that I'm trying to make it good. And I think when you try to make it good, it's inevitably shit. Whereas there's something about when you've lost all hope, you're just flying. You just have to try just put anything down, just spray any old shit out, that's weirdly when you stand a chance of hitting upon some interesting stuff.
Right.
But it's not pleasant for my collaborators.
So, I mean, I think you've kind of answered this question, but I was going to ask you sort of about the mechanics, really, of how you write. And it sounds to me like the actual writing of the text itself, the fingers to keyboard, whatever it is what happens right at the end of the process. So it's not that if you're mulling a play for 2 years, you're writing a bit every day. Is that right?
No. I tend to do it in bursts and fragments, but I have a method which by and large I've stuck to for at least about 15 years, where I don't start at the beginning of a play and write to the end. What I do is write fragments. So it's a semi-ordered process where with most plays I sort of carry around. There will come a moment where, having talked about it with the director and maybe structured things, maybe organised a workshop where we try a few little scenes, and you just try and get a tone of voice for things, and you just sort of try bits. There usually comes a point where I sort of write out the story, in lines or beats or something, or even just tell it. I usually try to tell it in the way that you might tell a taxi driver who said, "Oh, what do you do?" And you say, "I'm a writer," and they go, "Oh, what are you working on?" So I would usually say, like, well, it's a story about a Scottish knight in the Crusades who is going to Antioch, and he's traveling with his, whatever it is. And so I would try to write out that version, and then I would basically chop that up into units, and sometimes I write them on index cards, but basically shuffle it up into a big random heap. And I would then also add in other things like lines that I've thought of, or images that seem funny or interesting, or until I've got a pile. And if it's for a full-length play, the pile of cards would be about that big, and if it's for a half-hour play, it would be that big, sort of thing. Lanark was that, which is a bit frustrating, but basically, so I've got a pile of index cards about that big, and I shuffle it all up, and then I try to put a week or 2 weeks aside, and I turn over the top card, and it will say on it whatever it says. It might say, the siege of Antioch, or whatever it is. And so then I just have to write something in response to that.
Right.
And I just write whatever I can think of in response to that until I run out of steam. And then I turn over and do the next card. And I basically do that until all the cards are done. And then what I find is I can then go back to the cards and sort of arrange them on the floor back in the shape that they were in the storytelling shape. And then I can then go back to all the big pile now, huge pile of material, and I can arrange that in the storytelling shape. And really quickly, you can get rid of doublings and stuff and clear away crap. And you sort of end up with something that's not, I would never call it a first draft, but it's definitely contains loads of the stuff that you're going to need for your play. And what's of course good about it is it means you don't need to start at the beginning and finish, you don't make blank sheet of paper. You've got everything that you need is in there somewhere, and also a lot of it is terrible old nonsense that you've gone down a total blind alley of form or style, and you can get rid of it, but somewhere in there when you read it you go, oh, this is what they sound like, this is them, and you can then you know how to write it, because you can go back to the beginning and plug in bits where need it. So that actually is quite helpful also for adaptation, I would say, because it can result in a slightly bolder approach. So if I just say with Touching the Void, I turned over a card and it said Joe and Simon descend to the col. And, you know, I don't know when that happened, but I literally was quite bored by that point when on the day I was doing it. And I just didn't know I tried every different technique for climbing writing. And so I thought I'd write and climbers sometimes talk about these accidents as being epics. They say, oh, we had an epic. And so I thought, oh, well, I'll write an epic poem. Okay. So I wrote this sort of epic. I wrote the descent from the col as if it was an epic poem. And
do you mean like Homer?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, like right. It was, yeah. But it didn't rhyme. It rhymed a bit actually, but I think it was definitely, it was just a totally different. It was like as if someone around a campfire was telling the story of Joe and Simon, telling it in a sort of bardic way. And anyway, the long and the short, I turned the card over and carried on. You know, I totally forgot about it. But then when I came to put everything together, actually, not only did it sort of sufficiently do the job, but it was quite refreshing because it was different, you know. And I don't think I would have ever have done that if I'd been writing in proper order. Or do you see what I mean? That something about the rules of the game allowed me to just try loads of stuff out, and that sometimes means you end up with interesting solutions you wouldn't otherwise end up with.
And you've said, I know you've told me before that this method is in part about you trying to sort of trick or bypass your conscious mind from screwing things up or whatever it is. And it sounds a little bit like your late delivery method is partly that as well. Yeah. I mean, can you say anything about that? Why don't you trust your conscious mind to get involved too much in the writing of the plays?
Well, you know, when a person's trying to impress you and you sort of, you know, you don't, it's not impressive. You know what I mean? It's sort of, and I think there's something about when you're writing, it's very hard not to try to do it well.
Yeah.
But that's just never going to work. And some writers don't need this, but I am sort of human who can't help but try to be a nice boy and a good boy and do the right thing and impress people and be, you know, and so in order to reach the bit of me that's actually any good at this, I have to do some other thing. And there is comical examples of it, like when I did Midsummer, it was during the Travers, I think the year before, Simon Stevens wrote a play called Pornography that went on in Travers 1, sorry. And I liked it I thought Pornography was amazing. And Simon was sort of new on at the scene at that time, or quite, you know. And then I did this draft of Midsummer, and I remember me and the team, you know, Cora Bissett and Matthew Pidgeon, and I brought in this stuff, and I hadn't realised, but it was basically it was the Simon Stevens version of Midsummer. It was all of these sort of, you know, slightly bleak, sad monologues and things. And anyway, it was like, and I hadn't noticed myself doing it. I hadn't deliberately done it. I didn't sit down, but like I'd gone, oh God, why am I writing all this trivial nonsense? I must write something good, and something good is like this. And it was, I mean, like it was the moment it was read out loud, it was like grating your fingers down a blackboard. It was awful. Right. But a few times in my career that's happened, where it's like I've sort of let myself run away with myself.
Right.
And it's just I think it's just sort of, but there is a positive, which is that person is very useful once the first draft is done. Then there is a lot of use for that person who can then say, this is quite interesting. It reminds me of this Brecht play. You could borrow that technique, or you know, do you see what I mean? It's like,
absolutely. Yeah.
I sometimes think the relationship is like good teaching, that the writer of the first draft has to be quite like a child, and so the worst thing that you can do is sort of stand over the child and look and go, why are you playing like that? No, play like this, play with that piece of Lego. You know, you have to just sort of find some way in which you just let the child play. But once the child is sort of beginning to build, you can then go, actually, if you put that bit there, then it might make a bridge. Or do you see what I mean? There's ways in which,
completely,
like, you have to know, like, you must have this as a teacher. You don't go in and tell them how to do it, you know, that, or you tell them enough that they can find the right way. And exactly. It's a bit like that, I think.
So Solaris, let me ask a couple of things about that play, which of course is an interesting play to think about now, given it's a play about people in terrible, lonely isolation.
Yes, really lonely play.
So first of all, how did it come about?
Well, Matthew Lutton, the artistic director of the Malthouse Theatre, I had him come to the Lyceum with a play called a version of Picnic at Hanging Rock, which I really liked, thought was great. And when I got to know him, he liked genre, and he liked sort of doing theatre adaptations of genre films. And I thought that was really interesting. And he said, I really want to do Solaris. Would you do the adaptation? And I didn't really know it very well. I think I'd seen it maybe at university or something, but I just thought I knew it was quite cool and famous and sort of, you know, just sounded great. You know, it sounded like the sort of thing. So I said I'd have a look at it, and he said you should look at the novel. So I read the novel, and I thought it was really amazing and funny and surprising, and not what I thought it would be at all. And actually almost strangely set up as a play. I mean, if you think about it, it is a number of people trapped. I mean, at one point I thought about doing it almost in one room, because, you know, with exits to each sort of cabin, if you like, and just doing it in a living room, because basically it's 5 people trapped in a thing looking out of windows. So it's not, you know, I thought it would actually yield itself surprisingly interestingly. And anyway, so I said, yes, I'll do it from that point. But I think the other thing was, I was so interested in the central idea of it. This ball, this planet, this ball of water in space that may or may not be conscious. And they don't know, and it might be sending them dreams, or it might just be, there's a lovely bit where it says, so either it is basically this they start having visitors to their spaceship that come from their own consciousness, but are rendered physical, and what they don't know, so they all have different interpretations. And one of the scientists thinks that this is like a child who is offering you love. So like he has the metaphor, this comes from a novel, it says, you know, like when a kid sort of sees that you have a cup or something and takes it from you, then offers it back to you and makes it into a little toy to play with. But then this other scientist thinks this is absolutely a terrifying manifestation of nature's horrific ambivalent power, that it doesn't care anything. You know, only an idiot would think that there is anything but utter blankness, and this thing is looking into your mind and is going to, you know, consume you or eat you, or just simply, you know, tread on you. And then another scientist thinks a different thing, and so there's something about the central metaphor of that I found really compelling. And the other thing, though, which you mentioned, is that it just felt so much about loneliness. It's so unbelievably about loneliness, and that emotional tone. So the loneliness, not just of the central characters, but also of this giant ball. The line that in the book actually comes quite early on, but I found it really, really touching, is so if it is so that this planet is conscious, then it didn't know it was conscious until, because all it was just a thing. There was no other thing for it to be conscious with. And then along came this other set of consciousnesses, and it realized it was conscious. And so if they go now, if they leave, then it will know it's alone.
Yeah.
And I found that thought so sort of unbearable that it felt like a good motivation to write from. So yeah, and then I watched the film much later. So I tried to avoid the film, truthfully, in the.
You mean the Tarkovsky version?
Yeah, I mean, I watched all the films, including a rather splendidly interesting Russian television series from the 1970s, from the Soviet period, but and they were all brilliant and different and interesting. But I just thought, in the end, the book is what I'm adapting, so I'll just sort of stick to the book.
I think it's really interesting, the thing you were saying about how it's quite theatrical, because I thought particularly in the production with that great big shutter, sort of proscenium shutter that comes up and down, I was kind of thinking, it's about theatre, it's about this great force that sends out fake people for you that you massively invest in. And it felt like there was something kind of meta-theatrical. I mean, I
totally agree. And there was a number of bits where, yes, I mean, there's so many ways that metaphor works. But the first that I just always loved is when they stand looking out, because obviously Solaris, the window to which they look to the planet is you look to the audience, and they look, what is it thinking? What does it want? Do we please it? I don't know. I really like that. And I think it's got a really deep set of theatre metaphors, and also about writing and creativity and creation is all through it, because in a way, these little figures talking in our head feel like they're Solaris's creations. And I mean, I don't know. I really, really liked it. It's not normal for me to this is not normal for me to like my work, but I really did like Solaris. I partly because I think Matthew did such an interesting job on it. His strange, he's got a really interesting sensibility as a director, and I think he found, particularly in the production when it got to Scotland, he found this tone which was really moving and strange and just great imagery, But also, I think it's just up my alley,
right?
It's sort of emotional, but also, look, in fact, I said to Graham Etoff, it's basically a suspect culture play. This is like, suspect culture plays were all about contact. Can we ever make contact? Contacto personal was the line in Airport that Andres said, and it's always been that thing of I've said this to you a few times, but that thing of people in the past would say about suspect culture, they're plays about how we can't really ever make contact with each other. And I would say no, they're plays about how remarkably and extraordinarily we do make contact with each other, despite all the things. And Solaris is just exactly that, because this woman is going, no, I believe we can make contact. I believe we can make contact with this thing.
Yeah. And
ultimately she sort of believes in it so much, she sacrifices herself to that idea. And it was interesting because some people, I read that as unbearably and beautifully moving, that she stays in pursuit of contact. And I think she gets it, but other people read that same closing image as like, it proves that she was completely deluded, and that she sort of anyway, but that's sort of.
And so I read this book actually in the kind of late 90s or something, which means of course I can't remember much about it, but if you any book you adapt, there are going to be things about it that do lend themselves to a dramatic adaptation, and then there'll be some things that kind of resist it, that you have to deal with or address or transform in some way. What are the things that lent itself, do you think, to theatre? We said a little bit about those, but also what are the things that resisted?
There's surprising things that resist it. I mean, I just think there's some really interesting stuff about genre. So things that in a book are quite spooky, you know, like, so there was a scene that I labored over so much, and I don't think I ever really got right, but the first time she arrives on the spaceship, and everything's just a bit weird and wrong, and then finally she meets for the first time this splendidly named Dr. Sartorius, and and in the book, what happens is, you know, she sort of knocks on the door, and basically he sort of pops in his head and goes, "What do you want?" like this, and it says in the book that he has a big beard and he's got like scruffy things, and she says, "Well, I just want to, you know, find out what's happened to Professor Jabarian. You know, he died," and he goes, "Wow, are you accusing me? What are you doing?" You know, and basically it's quite a good scene in the book, and even in the film it's quite good. But the moment you write that, the moment I wrote anything like that on the stage, it was funny, because it just was funny. It's like, we know, it's like every cliche of the mad scientist, and because it's already, I think that was the other thing. So in the same way that doing climbing on stage is really difficult in a way that it isn't in film, because the moment that anybody says, like, we just know they're not climbing, you know, like, we can see you're on a stage. So when you go, "Oh, look, this, oh God, it's a really big, tall bastard," we're sort of thinking, no, you're just pointing. And particularly if they sort of go, "Oh no, I'm really worried about falling," we think, you know, with something, you have to find a way to overcome the inherent absurdity of the thing at all. And it was a bit the same with science fiction. Like, we know you're not on a spaceship. We just know you're not. Now, in film, science fiction is really great. And here would be a great example. So in film, even quite a badly made sort of tinfoil, you know, gun, foil covered gun, can be a ray gun, and we sort of go with it. We believe it. Whereas the moment that on a theatre stage you see any bit of scientific equipment, we just know it's been made by the stage manager. We just laugh at the idea of it. So with Solaris, we made an idea really early on that the aesthetic and the writing that we would go for, we said we'll set it in 1970s. So we thought, well, basically it was written in Poland in the 1950s, 60s. So we sort of said, everything will be from the 1970s. So because of course in the book they have literally got a library of books. You know, they haven't invented any, you know.
And they smoke as well.
They smoke, yeah.
It's such a weird
so
thing.
we put in that they smoke, that they have books and all that. And the reason for all of that, and I never let there be, I was really cagey about anybody saying things like, you know, we need to press the Zorbulator to make the, you know. So any of those things went. But I would say that in a film, you could probably do all of that stuff and have doors that slid and things. But we sort of had to try and keep all of that to an absolute minimum. And in the writing as well, it was really resistant to, it's almost like it's resistant to certain types of plot, because it's just comical to see that on a theatre stage. You have to.
It's interesting. It's interesting because I've recently had a conversation in this series with Alistair McDowell, and we were talking about his play X. And it was interesting because what I said to him that one of the things I thought was very impressive about X was the way it really securely inhabited that kind of 2001 Solaris Event Horizon sort of tradition in science fiction, and he really pushed back against it in a way that I was quite taken aback by. But actually, I can see that actually what he's saying is, you know, I don't want people to say, "Oh, well done, you wrote a science fiction play," because just like your version of Solaris, of course, the science fiction world is a paraphernalia for exploring loneliness.
Yeah.
Or, you know, I think in his case, it's about parenthood and memory and stuff like that. Because you're absolutely right. The ray gun on stage is such a different thing from the ray gun in a book or in a movie.
Yeah, and also from the actual gun on stage.
Yeah,
Like,
that's right.
like
Yeah,
a normal gun is quite good on stage. I mean, as
yeah,
Chekhov tells us, you know, so it's something about the stage seems to me to be slightly resistant to the future. And so our solution to that was to set it in the past. So essentially make it a period piece. I mean,
yeah.
yeah. One
Was there
thing
anything else about the other thing about what else about the book did you kind of find was less tractable than other elements? I vaguely remember. Okay, and this is a very old memory, so I might be wrong. And it was a summer of science fiction reading, so I may have mixed up another book. But I kind of remember. I remember really liking it, but also feeling like I was at times wading through quite a lot of sort of philosophical stuff about what would it be like if we encountered a completely different type of rationality, and it's kind of fine in a book because you can read it whatever speed you like. But I kind of imagine that would be quite hard to bring onto the stage.
Yeah. Well, that was Matthew being very good, actually, because I probably did have quite a lot of that still in it. I do quite like that sort of stuff. And we definitely cut loads in Australia, and even more when it came to Britain. There were quite big speeches where people would say, you know, how fascinating, for imagine if it were like this, then that would be the case. And that is fantastic. And, you know, as you say, it's brilliant thought. It's really interesting thought, but it really gets you bogged down and away from character and action. So I probably have to, but you're right, that is a thing. I mean, the whole first chapter of the book is one of my favorite bits of the book, and almost none of it is in the play, because the whole first chapter is like this imagined sort of future. I think of it as being an inspiration for Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, actually, because it's already got this idea of a library and an institute of Solarist studies. And this book is a kind of sort of summary of the history of Solarist studies. That is obviously a totally imagined scientific area. And it's written, it's quite funny, you know, it's sort of written, it's got a cheek to it, and its tone of voice is not unlike Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So that really made me laugh and think there was room in this story for humor. But unfortunately, just about none of it ended up in the play. The other bit that was resistant is Jabarian's diary. So, but that's an old-fashioned problem. So, in the book, she discovers Jabarian's. So one of the scientists has died just before she arrives, and it's very important to know what he thought. It's quite important for various reasons in the plot, and in the book that's done in the form of chapters, which are essentially reading his diary. And that's always very difficult on stage. And we eventually did use video. We thought of different ways of approaching it, but we eventually went with a thing that I normally don't like, which is the use of video. But I quite liked, because we were sort of setting it in the 70s, we decided that the video would be quite old-fashioned and Betamax almost, and have actual tapes and stuff. And it seemed like we could do some funny things with it. So rather than impress the audience with video, going, oh wow, they've really used video well, we sort of went the other way and made the video look rubbish.
Thank you. Pulling focus a bit now to a broader question about your work. And I'm asking everybody this question. Do you know what your plays are about?
Well, I mean, I know what some people say they're about, and I'm aware of that, if you see what I mean. And I don't think they're necessarily wrong. And then I would say there's another thing, which is, as one goes through life, I think inevitably one gets to know oneself. So I'm not saying everybody needs to have therapy or everybody, but you know, most humans, they've gone through relationship breakups or death of people or midlife crises or giving up alcohol or whatever, and they learn about themselves. You know, they go, oh, that's interesting. I have this pattern or this thing. And as one does that, I can then look back on various plays and go, oh God, of course it's about that, you know.
Yeah.
And all I would say is it's never really about the thing that you set out to write a play about. So Solaris, I now know exactly what Solaris is about, precisely, to the extent to which some of the dialogues within it are internal dialogues that I can look and go, oh my God, I mean, it's literally you're writing out that particular fear or that particular desire. But at the time, I absolutely did not know that. I absolutely thought I was writing about consciousness and so on. Looking back at Europe, I saw Europe in the Donmar production. And what stood out to me was not that it was either prescient or not prescient about the condition of you know, migrants in Europe, but that it was about a young married couple and the tensions between them in a particular way, you know, and again, I went, oh God, that's, you know, that's actually what you were writing about. Or, so I guess what I mean is there's always the aboutness, which is the aboutness in the public sense. I don't know. I mean, I can have an opinion like everybody else,
right,
but the aboutness that gives it its energy is almost certainly something which, in a way, is trivial to anybody else, because what do they care about, you know, the particularities of, you know, my relationship in 1992? But somewhere in that is something that is the motor that would have been driving the play to come into existence, I think.
And this is my last question. I suppose where we began actually was you talking about having these original plays sort of in a holding pattern above your life, waiting to descend. And you say you've had some of these plays for a decade. Of course, these are plays that might have been conceived potentially in a slightly different world.
Yeah, tell me about it. Yes.
Right. Than the one, you know, we don't know what the world will be like once we're out of this pandemic, however and whenever that happens. Is that something you're thinking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only playwright who has had the shivers as they've realized they can't write their, you know, dystopian. I mean, I had read so many plays that had various dystopian, you know, because as the artist director, I get a lot of plays through, and, you know, good plays and bad plays that, you know, begin with somebody going, before the sickness, we all, you know, that was from before the sickness time, you know, and things like that. And or the other one that was very, very common is plays in which water levels rise in some way during the play, and everybody ends up splashing and things. And I'm being sort of frivolous, but, you know, I understand it. It's a very powerful set of fears and imagery. And of course, now that we are actually living through a thing against which we can check these dystopian descents, I don't know what they will. I don't know if you can complete those. Anyway, those plays certainly take on a very different feeling, and they may seem rather flimsy. The reason I say that is that I have two plays in particular that are challenged by this moment. One may be less than the other, but so there's a play which I've been intending to write for over a decade, which is the sort of conclusion of the story of Keith and Vivian, who were in Cosmonaut and then in Pyrenees. And I've kind of got a kind of sketchy version of half, the play. I did quite a bit of work with Vicky on it when she was at National Theatre of Scotland. And the play concerns them driving home from France in their Volvo, and then they get caught in a traffic jam in on the autoroute, and they don't really know. It's just traffic jam seems to go on endlessly, and then they kind of end up picking up this hitchhiker who's a young woman migrant on the run, and then slowly the traffic jam starts to move. But what you begin to realize as the play goes on is that increasingly the world around them is kind of crumbling as they go, and the play sort of ends with them, the three of them, pulling the Volvo with a rope, like Mother Courage pulling her cart, through the Highlands of Scotland as they try to reach a cottage. And it was all very, not to say it was very funny, but when I thought of that 10 years ago, none of the things that were in it had in any sense happened at all. Right. It was quite a funny idea to think of. Whereas now, not just with the virus, but so much nuttery has happened in the last 6 years, that the idea of this traffic jam, and then the news reports being weird, and then you don't know if you can get across the border and all that. So I don't know what I'm going to do with that play, because I do think I probably still have to write it. I still want to write it, but I think I have to think, am I setting it in a reality, or am I going to, it's not a future fiction, is it a period piece? I don't know the answer. So in a way, that play is definitely taken a bit of a bashing. But the other ones, I think it's probably a good test, actually, that it was weird when this all started to happen. I really, really wanted to write, and I hadn't had that feeling in quite that visceral a form for quite a long time. Right. I really had this profound feeling of wanting to write. And I think there's a little bit of old-fashioned mortality in there, just a tiny little bit of, death is stalking the land, and it's sort of great vulture-like wings, sort of casting a shadow, and so you sort of think, ooh. And I think a bit of me is going, well, you better get what you've got to do done, because you never know. But anyway, whatever it was, I definitely wanted to write. But what I found interesting was that I absolutely did not want to write anything about now. I wanted to complete the work. So I hope, in a way, it's quite a good test, that it gets rid of sort of things that would have been rather flimsy, actually. Right. I mean, in a way, it's lucky, because if I'd written that stuff, you wouldn't be able to stage them now, because they would be flimsy. Whereas now, at least I know what it's like to go through these things. And if it's a bit of a cliche, to put them on stage. So therefore I won't, do you see what I mean? It might be positive in that regard.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, David. That was fascinating as always.
I was setting that up. I got it upside down, I think.
Anyway, thank you very much.
It was fun, Dan. Thank you.
See you soon. Bye.